This morning what we're going to do is have a brief introduction to the workshop and give you some background, just quick background and context of how we all got here. And then we're going to have a series of plenaries today, followed by breakout activities. And I will just reintroduce myself. I'm Chris Osborne. I've been leading the organizing committee for this effort. And so let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to actually start with a land acknowledgement. And I'm just going to pause for a moment so we all can read this. So I'd like to actually start out by thanking OCB for sponsoring this workshop. This is a scoping workshop where we're starting to build a community thinking about extreme events and specifically the time domain related to them. So I have to acknowledge Heather Benway and May Hagan and Mary Swoyski, who have been instrumental and a fantastic group to work with and organizing this for everybody. Let's just give them a round of applause. And as we go through, I'll just remind folks that we're going to be, since we're doing this by Zoom, we'll have questions coming in from the chat. We will read those questions aloud so the audience can hear them here. And then we will also restate questions from the audience so our Zoom folks can hear. I also need to recognize the Science Organizing Committee. So you can see our collective faces here. And on the left, you'll see the different subgroups that we have. And so you can see how we've broken out across the different 4 topics that we'll be addressing today and tomorrow. Along with that, we'll also have a session on observations. So many thanks to the organizing committee and much appreciation for the multiple Zooms I've put you through over the past few months. And here we are. So this is all very exciting. So where did we start? Well, last NACT meeting, we had a breakout group that talked about extreme events. And we got this session going by thinking about how, boy, we really don't know how the time dimension plays out with these events. We know a lot about fluxes, and we know a lot about movement of carbon and materials throughout the Earth system, but we have this knowledge gap that we conceptualize as the seesaw. And here is the illustrious version that I sketched out on my kitchen counter, because this was by Zoom. And you can actually see the beginnings of our lovely emblem that we have now, the seesaw. And we heard a lot about this yesterday with our lightning talks and saw a lot about it on our poster, the posters that we saw. And so trying to understand how the landscape interacts with the coastal zone, interacts with the coastal and pelagic ocean, and it's sort of the underpinnings of that. And you can just see in some of these, in this diagram here, how we can have connections between, say, the main channel of the system and riparian wetlands, tidal wetlands, and receiving waters. And so we came up with this idea that organic carbon is stored in soil and wetlands. It's released during these events. And admittedly, when we started out, as indicated by the 2 squiggles here, we were thinking mainly about tropical storms and extreme event or extreme precipitation events. We built that out into thinking about fires, and I'll argue that drought is also an important component of this. So these are all aspects and events and forcing factors that have a time dimension to them. And so thinking about how replenishment, depending on modifications to vegetation type and productivity, these all sort of come together to make these pulses, these delivery mechanisms that then in receiving waters have some faith to them in terms of how organic carbon is degraded, buried, or even replenished within these systems. So we've decided to try to formalize this time domain a bit more. And so we came up with a proposal to OCB, and I hope you all had a chance to look through that or read through it. And so we formalized this a little bit more. We updated the sketch, And so we have these concepts of carbon storage, disturbances that release this material, and then ultimately the transformation. And then at the bottom, I've just got a little blurb here, an excerpt that says that we further posit that these types of processes are occurring over a range of temporal scales. And so that's one thing that I want to kind of reiterate, is thinking about how the temporal scales of all the different aspects of carbon and nutrient cycling that we're interested in play out. And key to that is something that I also hope will come out of this workshop, is an increase in our ability to do things like biogeochemical storm chasing. So we know from the meteorology group that they're really good at going out and observing these events and collecting all aspects of information on that. And so we would like to maybe perhaps use that model to build a network of response teams that can go out and observe these events. Now, what we also saw yesterday is that, in fact, the events are great and they're extreme, but if we don't have good understanding of what the baseline is, we don't have a way to understand really what these events are doing. So I'd also like to make a push for thinking about observational networks as we go through this next couple of days. So we also asked you all to answer a few questions and give you a little pre-workshop survey to complete. And so what I'm going to do here is just show the highlights of that, because this is obviously a conversation we're trying to start. And so we first asked you to rank the following parameters in response to extreme events. And what these parameters are different things we thought might be important for that time dimension. And so this is a bar chart showing the actual rankings for each one of the multicolored processes, and I've reproduced them at the top so it's a little bit easier to see. So we're talking about the degree of human alteration of the landscape, ecoregion, hydrodynamics, tidal dynamics, and then event frequency. And what is cut off is the light blue, which is steepness of biogeochemical gradients. But the important thing is to show that at least for the folks that answered the 30 plus answers to this ranking, we can see that the degree of human alteration of the landscape is one that is very prominently ranked first, as was event frequency. And so that human alteration of the landscape has occurred, of course, over time. And so the time dimension plays out again in how we were ranking these. And this information will be compiled along with the other aspects of the workshop in our final recording. So we'll be able to look at these results later as well. Refer back to it. So another thing we asked you is what your thoughts were on the key knowledge gaps. And I'm going to take just a moment to let you all look through these. So I won't necessarily read through them. And I didn't capture every response, but I just picked out ones that sort of caught my eye as I was doing a quick scan of this. Again, your responses are captured. We'll include that information in the reporting out from the workshop. Okay, and then thanks to all that did answer the poll. I think as you can read from these that there's a lot of very coherent themes that are coming out that we can see, and the knowledge gaps are decidedly focusing on that time dimension. So then, as a way to kind of wrap up where we are with the introduction for this workshop, we asked you to consider what might be some of the most important deliverables. And as responses, we had funding pathway. So that could be a research campaign or field campaign, for example, something like geotraces or exports. So a big overarching program, multi-institutional, that sort of thing. A synthesis paper, proposal development, model development, sentinel sites, which means where can we go to observe the seesaw in action, And then related to that, research coordination network that refers to sort of like the biogeochemical storm training or storm chasing that I referred to. And then there was a final entry that is a bit longer, but it says all of these things would be good. And I think that's important too, that we don't want to be too prescriptive or exclusive. And just to give you a sense about how the couple of days will run, today, as I mentioned, we'll have a series of plenaries and then a breakout in the afternoon. So some work that you'll have to do. And then this evening, what will happen is we'll reconvene for an informal dinner at the Morgan Street Food Hall, continuing the conversation. On Tuesday, we'll have plenaries in the morning looking at modeling and observational networks, and then more breakouts in the afternoon. During these 2 days, we'll have breaks periodically, coffee breaks, and networking opportunities. We really want to continue the conversation. Okay? We really want to continue the conversation. And so feel free to go next door and grab a coffee or water as you need it, and then chat with people. And I also want to mention that John Kalnowski will be we'll be running a polling that we'll do using an application called Mentimeter. And so you'll be prompted to go to a website. You can do this on your mobile device or your laptop and answer a snap poll. Again, we're trying to get feedback, continue the conversation. I would now like to turn it over to Heather Benway, who will tell us a little bit more about OCB.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I just want to keep this as quick as possible. I want to get us back on schedule. A lot of you in this room already know what OCB is. OCB stands for Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry. OCB has been here since 2006. And I have been working with OCB since 2007, which is crazy. You can get a sense of OCB is really a big scientific network. It's really a worldwide network. Its funding is US-based. OCB receives about 75% of its funding from NSF, Biological and Chemical Oceanography, and about 25 to 30% of its funding from NASA Ocean Biology and Biochemistry. So please thank your program managers for the fact that this program has been in existence for as long as it has. We have a project office based at Woods Hole Oceanographic, so I get to be a program manager from Woods Hole instead of living in DC. So I really appreciate that because I am in a really nice intellectual space, so I'm interacting with OCB scientists all the time, and I really appreciate that about my job. We have, you can see the green icons here. They depict our overarching research areas. It's a pretty broad focus. OCB is really interested in biogeochemical cycling, in the role of organisms in biogeochemical cycling, and how marine ecosystems are shifting and changing in response to climate change and climate variability. You can get a better sense of our specific research questions on our website. I encourage you to visit. There's so much information there. I want to highlight this because the beauty of OCB is it is a bottom-up, grassroots, community-driven program. And so OCB's focus areas and research questions are shifting in response to what the community and what changing climate deem high priorities. And this is one of them. This is something that I wanted to see come to fruition since I started talking with Chris, and I've been working with Libby, who is here from the North American Carbon Program. And OCB has been coordinating with and collaborating with the North American Carbon Program for a long time, looking at processes in the land-ocean continuum, that area where the terrestrial meets the ocean. There's a lot of action there, especially with regards to carbon cycling and nutrient cycling. So this is just yet another example, and you could see from the cocktails napkin sketch, this all started with a breakout session at the North American Carbon Program's All Scientists meeting a couple years ago, and it has just, there was a webinar series. You can access all of this from the website, but there's been a lot of action on this. And so we're really excited to have Chris who submitted this proposal, to have this workshop, and this is just the very beginning. I want to encourage you all to be thinking with regards to those specific research priorities and questions we need to answer to be able to assemble the observing and modeling resources we need to tackle this great challenge. This is urgent. This is something we need to do now. So I'm really excited to be here and have you all here. You can learn more about us on our website. I don't want to spend too much time just give you a sense of what we do. This is one example: workshops, activities, working groups, synthesis activities. There's actually a coastal carbon synthesis activity that's pretty relevant to this that took place over about 8 years between the NECP and the OCB communities. It really brought together ocean and terrestrial scientists. We do training activities as well. Science leadership and planning, communications and networking, training and capacity building, and education and outreach are kind of our mission areas. I want to point out, and we'll see, at least there was, it looks like they all got taken down, actually. I don't know why, but I can put up some signage and I'll put it up again. We have a pretty strict policy and code of conduct in OCB. We really want to make sure that our meetings are safe and respectful places. So these are our ground rules for code of conduct, and I'm going to put up a QR code that if anybody has an issue, if you scan the QR code, it will take you right to the code of conduct page, and there's a reporting form, and it is anonymous, and it will come to me and my other staff members, and we will address it immediately. So if you witness anything or you experience anything that is disrespectful or uncomfortable, I want you to go there, or you can pull me aside and I will be happy to talk to you about it. A couple of other reminders. I did have, there's a big agenda up here just to keep our speakers and our plenary session on track, but I did have printouts and I will put them up again. And there's actually a little QR code on there. For those of you who may not have your computers with you, you can scan the QR code on the agenda and it'll take you right to the participant documents folder. And you can get anything you want on your smartphone. Bathrooms are out there to the left. And the polls are going to be awesome. John put together some really great questions. So please participate in those Menti polls because those are really going to be great for fueling our discussions in the breakouts. I'm going to put some materials in the breakout rooms for fun brainstorming. There'll be some big notepads that you can stick on the walls and markers and sticky notes. Take advantage of those materials because those are really fantastic for group brainstorming exercises. So there'll be some in the breakout rooms and we'll make sure there are some down here in this main room too. If you want to grab a piece of paper and stick it on the wall and start sketching out ideas, that's what this is for. So use these tools as much as you can. Posters, I want to encourage you to make sure you get to the posters. We did have these boards in the next room over with the coffee, and I might see if we can move them back over there. I didn't really want them in here. And virtual breakout sessions. For those of you who are joining us online, Sasha Kramer is going to lead virtual breakout sessions so that you can all participate and provide your input. So that's going to be a great tool. We have a breakouts folder in the participant resources where you can access all of that information. There are notes, documents, and if you're more of a visual person, there's also the Google Jamboards for each breakout, so you can draw and have fun and put sticky notes in that. If you have any questions at all, please come talk to me. I'm nice, I hope and I want to introduce Libby Larson from the North American Carbon Program, who's just going to say some words about NECP.
I'll do this quickly. I wasn't sure how much information is out, but NECP, for those of you who might not know, is a multi-agency, multidisciplinary group of scientists at a whole range of different types of institutions who are all focused on studying carbon sources and sinks in North America and adjacent oceans. And it is a primary activity of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, and we're the sort of sister program to OCB. We have about 2,600 people sort of on our general mailing list. We were started around 2002, and we really expand like as much as the different components of this that you can think of in terms of observational, experimental modeling, all those types of things, and different components of the carbon cycle. I'll just flash this up quickly. We have a science leadership group that meets on a sort of semi-annual to quarterly basis to sort of talk about what are the important things that we should be working on, and different types, similar to OCB, we sometimes do workshops or other things. I should have had a slide in here. We're in the middle of running what we're calling a CDR Academy. So it's a series of webinars to talk about what does carbon dioxide removal mean and look like in different types of Earth systems. We had our first two last Thursday, and November 3rd, we have one that's on forests and tidal wetlands, and then just across on the 4th is going to give one on ocean CDR. So sort of, I know that OCB just had the marine CDR stuff, which I wish I could have gone to, but I was at the NASA Carbon Monitoring System Science Team meeting, which unfortunately was at the same time. In any case, so there's lots of activities. I should have also put the NACP website on there, but I didn't do that part either. Oh, and I have stickers, a limited number, if anyone's interested in the tiny bit of swag. These are sort of the main program elements for the things that that we think are important, and that we have different groups of people who sort of are more focused on different components of this than others. These program elements come out of our science implementation plan, which we have a new one that's just going through agency review right now, and hopefully will be posted very soon. So NACP, just for a tiny bit more context, back when it first started, it was actually there were several different federal agencies who actually had specific funding calls that said these will be NACP projects, and so we built this kind of like big project database, and we had these things like the Mid-Continent Intensive campaign, and we had disturbance and site level synthesis activities, and all of that was feeding into the first State of the Carbon Cycle report, and then in sort of the most recent decade, there's some of that has continued. As Heather mentioned, we were involved in also the CCARs for the coastal carbon, and then of course really importantly the second State of the Carbon Cycle report. But what's happened over the past few years is that the agencies are not having those sort of NACP specific calls anymore. And so NACP has really kind of evolved more into a community of practice, and that I send out a monthly newsletter, and we have the SLG, and we have a Discord server for discussion, and we organize different activities, but it's not the same that it used to be, but I think that there's still a really important role that we can play.
Good morning, all. I'm Paerl with the UNC Institute of Marine Sciences down the coast here, Hurricane Alley, better known. And I had the honor of leading the first charge on two plenary talks, which I will follow really quickly. We're going to have Kenneth Kunkel first, from the North Carolina Institute of Climate Sciences, and then Kevin Reed from Stony Brook. And I'm looking forward to some really great talks to get things going. And one other comment that I'm really very grateful for being able to attend this meeting is that it's a really nice interdisciplinary crowd, which I think is really important when we start talking about this context of the continuum. I've been harping on this for a long time in terms of the harmful algal blooms and things like that, but now we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty carbon and nutrients, and I think we've got a great crowd to address that and have some really good spirited discussions.
Appreciate the invitation to be here. You have to say what you were saying. Just looking at the posters last night, that seeing how, from my point of view, how meteorology and climatology apply into the summer theory, which I'm not very familiar with. So there's a lot of examples recently of heavy rain. This topic of today's talk. Hurricane Harvey, of course, in 2017, dumped nearly 60 inches. Some of the reports were above 60 inches, but recent quality control of those observations suggests that the maximum only in the 50s inches. Of course, Hurricane Florence just down the road here deposited more than 30 inches at several locations, the highest a little over 36 inches. There was a subtropical low in Louisiana in 2016 that deposited 31 inches. Last September, there was a very rapidly moving heavy rain event caused by Hurricane Ida that dropped rainfall amounts that in some cases exceeded the 100-year return period, caused all kinds of disruptions and flash flooding in that area. And then just this summer, a number of events. St. Louis in late July, more than 12 inches. Eastern Kentucky, late July, more than 14 inches. And Dallas, late August, more than 13 inches. I was getting inquiries from news media about how many 1,000-year events have there been. And it's just unusual. But we don't really count this kind of thing, so didn't really give them the answer they wanted on that. And just last month, Hurricane Ian deposited more than 22 inches in parts of Florida. So this is the continental U.S., and then we've got other events that are not on here, maybe most notably Hurricane Fiona that dropped near over 2 feet of rain in parts of Puerto Rico and caused another catastrophe for them. So really a lot going on, but anecdotes do not make trends. So that's what this talk is about. Let's look at what the data show. Just before we do that, here's Hurricane Harvey, the distribution of extreme rain, large area there in the browns and reds that had more than 24 inches of rain. And here's Hurricane Florence, your station events, and the yellow and red colors indicate more than 20 inches. So you see that's in the southeastern part of the state. So this talk is about, has extreme precipitation increased, more than just the anecdotal kind of suggestion, and what historical evidence can support what we might expect for the future risk of extreme precipitation. So first, let me very briefly talk about some analysis I've done regarding U.S. historical trends. So I'll show some selected results from the Fourth National Climate Assessment, and then I've also done an extensive analysis of data from long-term observing stations, looking at multiple metrics of extreme precipitation, in particular defined by duration and recurrence interval, a range of durations from 1 to 30 days, and a range of recurrence intervals from 1 to 20 years. And there's 7 durations, 5 recurrence intervals, we have 35 combinations. So I'll show results for all 35 of those. So first, National Climate Assessment. I produced this graphic for the Fourth National Climate Assessment. This is the number of station events of 2-day duration precipitation that exceed a threshold for 5-year recurrence interval. So I think the story, and this is updated from the Fourth National Climate Assessment, that went through 2016. This goes through 2020. And I think the story is pretty clear here that there's been a substantial increase in the number of these events over the U.S. over the last 3 decades. And in this particular analysis, the last decade or the last 5-year period, these are 5-year periods, is the highest in the record going back to 1900. And I suspect that based on, if nothing more than the anecdotal evidence that when I updated to 2021 and 2022, the story won't change. Well, the other part of the story that's in the National Climate Assessment is the spatial distribution of these trends. So I produced this graphic, which shows the trend, the change over this 100+ year period by region across the U.S. And if you look at these numbers, what you see is a very pronounced spatial variation in this. The eastern part of the U.S. has experienced very large increases in this particular metric, but the western U.S. has experienced much smaller increases And in the case of the Southwest, it's even negative, nominally negative. It's not statistically significant. So we have this east-west dipole pattern, which is an interesting feature that you can't really fully explain. Okay, now this is this analysis of all these combinations of duration and recurrence interval. So each one of these tables that are shown here are the results for a region, and each cell is one combination of duration and recurrence interval. So there's 35 cells in each of these tables. The teal colors indicate upward trends, the brown colors indicate downward trends. And by the way, there's a national composite table on the lower left-hand side. So first of all, I don't know how vivid these colors are. Well, they're vivid enough that teal is almost everywhere. So almost everywhere, there are upward trends in extreme precipitation. And the results we show in the fourth National Climate Assessment, the upward trends we show there are not just maybe a fortuitous choice of duration and recurrence interval. It doesn't really matter what we choose. We get this upward trend, at least when we look at it on a national scale. But we also see in this a dipole pattern. If you look at west, the tables out west, there's a mix of upward brown and teal colors, upward and downward trends. They're all very small. Almost none of them are statistically significant. So we're really not seeing anything out west in the data. If you look at the national composite, everything is teal, everything's upward on a national composite basis. And the other thing I'll point out from this table is you can't see it here, but durations on the horizontal and recurrence intervals on the vertical of these tables. And the higher up are the longer recurrence intervals, or the more rare events. So if you look at that national composite table in particular, what you see is that the trends are larger for the rarer events. So the highest trends we find are for the 20-year recurrence interval. Okay, so now what about Harvey and Florence, two of the most catastrophic events we've experienced here with regard to flooding. And what I'm going to show you is an analysis I did where I look now at a little bit of a different metric for extreme precipitation. What I'm looking at here are area averaged rainfall amounts rather than station events. All that other analysis was based on first an analysis of station data that was just aggregated to the regional level or national level. Here, we're going to actually first compute area average rainfall and look at how that ranks in historical record. So I looked at 4- and 5-day rainfall totals. Those were chosen because Harvey was sort of mainly a 5-day event. Florence was mainly a 4-day event. So it was sort of organized around those two events to just see how unusual were those two events. And then I did a number of different area sizes. I'm going to show you your results for 50,000 square kilometers. So that's the average rainfall over 50,000 square kilometers. So first we do this, and then we look historically over the nation and over time at how the amounts rank. So this was, I did this analysis for a 70-year period, 1949 to 2028. I picked out the top 100 events, the 100 largest area average rainfall events. So what I'm going to show you next, on the next slide, is a ranking, the rainfall amount versus rank. I'm just going to show you the first 30 events, the highest 30 events. So this is that ranking. So highest rank is on the left. So there's Harvey. Harvey is the highest ranked event. Not only is it the highest ranked event, look where number 2 is. So it's number 1 by a large margin. In fact, it's about 50% higher than the second ranked event. That value is 600 millimeters or about 24 inches. So for 50,000 square kilometer area, Harvey does an average of 24 inches of rain. Well, Florence is no slouch. You notice here, it's ranked number 7. So it indeed ranked historically. Again, this is over the whole US. So we're not looking at just North Carolina. Recently, we're looking at the whole US. Okay, so next, where are these events located, these 100 events? So this is a map of the location of the top 100 events. So we have two clusters here, a large cluster in the southeastern US and another cluster in the western US. So I guess it's probably obvious that the cluster in the southeastern US is mostly a result of the availability, nearby, proximate availability of lots of water vapor at a very warm, usually warm Gulf of Mexico and the Western Atlantic. So we got a source of moisture there. The events in the Western US, really two big things there. One, all of these events are associated with atmospheric rivers, and these are essentially taps of moisture from the subtropics and tropics. So we got, once again, we got a source of abundant moisture that's coming into the West Coast. And then the second big factor there is simply topography, that any system there, the precipitation is enhanced by forced outward descent over the mountains in the west. The other thing here, just to point out, well, let me go to the next slide. So how are these distributed over time? We have 100 events over 70 years. What I did is I simply counted how many, I basically broke the 70-year period into 7 decades and looked at how they were distributed over time. And so this is that distribution over time. So here we've got more events occurring in the latter part of the period than the first period. And also the last decade in this particular analysis has the highest number of events, but 1/4 of the events occurred in this last 10-year period. So a general upward trend in this particular metric. Now, quick question or quick comment about causes. I don't want to get into this. We looked at the meteorology of these 100 events. What causes that? Got all these events on the Gulf Coast. You might think, yeah, these are all hurricanes, tropical cyclone events. Well, a lot of them are. About 1/4 of them are overall if you look nationally. But, and that's in the green here. The green show the tropical cyclone caused events. But actually, more of them are caused by fronts, which is perhaps a little bit surprising. But fronts often can produce rainfall, of course, over large areas. If they're semi-stationary, you've got this tap of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and can produce very large rainfall. Okay, so large increases in extreme precipitation nationally. These increases are concentrated in the eastern half of the U.S. I'm not showing any global results here, but I've done some global analysis, and the IPCC's latest assessment report shows some global analyses. There are many more observing stations globally that exhibit increases than decreases. So then why? Well, the IPCC makes some statements in the last report about this. I'm just going to read these. First statement, most of the observed intensification of heavy precipitation over land regions is likely due to anthropogenic influence, for which greenhouse gas emissions are the main contributor. Kind of a general statement, but to get down to the underlying cause, they also point out there's a human contribution to the observed increase in atmospheric moisture, and that's what they state is the primary link then to heavy precipitation. However, they do say on the spatial scale of regions, now AR6 has different definitions of regions, but nevertheless, there's I think three regions that cover the US. The evidence of human influence on extreme precipitation is limited, and that's mostly due to kind of signal-to-noise ratio statistical issues. You have smaller regions, you're talking about extremes to begin with. So to identify a signal related to human contributions is much more difficult. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the causes, in particular the link to atmospheric water vapor. And I'd like to first talk about the oceans. Over the oceans, the lowest part of the atmosphere is generally near saturation because there's an unlimited supply of water. So the atmosphere quickly reaches kind of an equilibrium state where it's saturated with water vapor. And most extreme precipitation producing weather systems pull their moisture directly from oceanic sources. So now let's look at what's been happening over the oceans, and specifically with regard to temperature. So this shows a time series of sea surface temperatures over the northern hemisphere, averaged over the whole northern hemisphere. And there's been increases in sea surface temperatures, smaller than the changes in temperature over the land, but this has been a very steady increase in sea surface temperatures due to forcing through greenhouse gas increases. And so we've, although we can't make a formal attribution statement, overall the likely caused by the increases we've seen, apart from the increase in moisture over the oceans. Digging into that deeper, we've done some climatological analysis, specifically investigating the extent to which extreme precipitation amounts in the U.S. Can be related directly to atmosphere water vapor content, and just provide kind of the baseline for that. I think we're all aware of the relationship between saturation, water vapor pressure, water vapor concentration, and temperature. It's an exponential relationship. So the increase, as we increase temperature in atmospheric moisture, is quite large, about 7% per degree Celsius. So we have at least a mechanism whereby warming leads very directly to increased extreme precipitation. So what we did, we looked at a whole set of historical extreme precipitation events. So this is only limited to extreme events. I looked at what the atmospheric moisture was at the time at that event, and then kind of aggregated it over the whole U.S. And so this is what we found. So this shows the kind of a box and whisker diagram for a number of bins of atmospheric moisture. We used a particular metric called precipitable water, which is the integrated amount of water in the troposphere. And what we find is this monotonic relationship between precipitation amounts in these extreme events and atmospheric water vapor. Perhaps more importantly, I guess I jumped ahead there a little bit. More importantly, the aerial coverage of extreme amounts turns out to be a very strong function of the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. In fact, it looks like there it's not even linear, maybe also exponential. And so the capacity of the atmosphere and the meteorology to produce large area extent of extreme precipitation is much larger than water vapor is higher. Okay, so what does this do with regard to future projections? So what I want to show you here now, and you might expect, well, we have this very fundamental property of water, this very strong exponential dependency of saturation, water vapor, concentration, and temperature. And you might expect that will play out in our climate models, and indeed it does. So what I'm going to show you is some analysis I've done with the most recent suite of publicly available climate model simulations, so-called CMIP-6, archived climate model simulations, which was used in the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what the models do in a warmer world with regard to water vapor. And I'm specifically going to just look at near surface water vapor, and I'm going to look at a metric which is the annual maximum value of water vapor. So I'm not going to look at overall water vapor. I'm just looking at the maximum amount that these models produce. So I did this analysis for, I think, 44 models. So what I'm going to show you is simply a multi-model average for these 44 CMIP-6 models. And so this is the picture. Once again, teal colors are increases, brown colors are decreases. And I'd like you to look very carefully and see if you can find any brown in this map. And the answer is no. It's all upward. So these models are responding to this very basic property of water vapor and indeed increasing water vapor, not just over the oceans, but over all the land areas as well. And furthermore, I looked at each of these, but I did some statistics on the models. So if you look at all these 44 models, there's only two or three models that produce any ground anywhere in the globe. And even those models, it's a small areas over the subtropical ocean. Okay, so now, what do the models do with regard to just total precipitation? So do they increase total precipitation across the globe? Well, the answer is no. And in fact, we have a pattern here that's become right. So these are, again, projections of total annual precipitation for the 4 seasons, and all the 4 seasons look basically about the same. And this has become what I would call a canonical pattern that the models produce in response to a warmer world. They produce more precipitation over tropics and high latitudes, and they produce less precipitation over generally subtropical areas. And so when we look at total precipitation, what this indicates is that water vapor is one component, but the other component, which is just as important, is atmospheric circulation, atmospheric weather. And the changes that occur in that are actually the primary determining factor for annual precipitation. What about extreme precipitation? So what I did next, I'm going to show it to you here. I chose another, even more extreme metric to look at here for extreme precipitation. So I'm looking at 2 30-year periods and taking the difference. So what I did was look at for each model, for each grid point, the single highest value in a 30-year period. So let's say, since I'm looking at 30 years, it's called 30-year storm in the model. And look at how that changed, then averaged over the 44 models that I had. And so this is what that produces. So in this case, when we look at this extreme metric, we see increases almost everywhere. So for the most part, even in the areas where the models are producing less precipitation, they're producing more, or the extreme precipitation amounts are high. Now that's not universal. Unlike humidity, it's not universal. We do have these small areas in subtropical ocean where we're actually seeing decreases. But the basic picture is one. When we look at extremes, this increase in water vapor, for the most part, this in the models is driving. That's it.
For questions?
It's a way to or a big question. Or basically, what I wonder is like if you look at the regional forecast models, and I don't know if they do hard tests for those, but do you feel like they are picking up these kind of extreme events in the regional forecast model well? So could we use those as a toolbox for looking at these kind of events? Because normally when we're working in the ocean, we use ERA reanalysis data and so on. For these kind of events, they are a little bit coarse.
Yeah. So you're talking about some of the
hydrodynamo and war, that kind of model.
Yeah, her simulation, something like that, Nightcast. Some of these really high resolution kinds of things. Yeah.
Exactly. Would they pick up these kind of frequencies and patterns in the way that they're useful for this kind of exercises?
It's a good question. And I guess the question would be, it's really maybe 2 questions. One, will they pick up the rainfall distribution for a particular event? That would be one question. The other one would be, do they pick up the climatological changes that occur? Are you talking about one of these or both of them?
I do actually talk about both of them because it's like it is a combination of like, can we use this to understand if we have, for example, biochemical observations a couple of years back, and we want to backtrack and see what was the weather conditions before that. Could we use those kind of runs? And the other thing exactly as you said, like, from a kind of like or distribution wise, can we use these models as a kind of workbench to understand the patterns?
think that would kind of give a qualified yes to that. I think the models, like in hindcast mode, the high resolution models usually can simulate the distribution of these single events fairly well. And when people look at even the reanalysis, they do pick up these overall trends too. So, not perfectly, but so one has to always keep that in mind.
Oh, yeah.
Other questions?
Thanks, I enjoyed your talk. I was curious, you talked about where what types of different events are increasing, right? Like hurricanes versus fronts. And I was curious if you see that in the climate models, if you can see, this large increase in fronts, is that continuing? Is there a reason to think like that's going to increase more than hurricanes in the projections as well?
Yeah, so, I've done quite a bit of work on what the causes of the meteorological causes of these extreme events. Kevin's done some work, his group, and so I would say that number one, I think the question is out whether or not climate models can reproduce all of these things. The climate models at their typical resolution aren't great at tropical cyclones, so just too coarse. As far as the future is concerned, kind of the jury is out with regard to tropical cyclone changes, whether or not the numbers will increase or decrease. I think there's a tendency in the models to get maybe the actual decrease in the number of tropical cyclones, but an increase in the strongest tropical cyclones. So there's kind of two things going on there. When we look at fronts is the other big event that we see in the historical record. And in general, the models suggest it decreases in fronts in the summertime and little change in the other three seasons, at least the analysis I've done thus far. And that's actually important to think about. Fronts in the summer are important. They're actually very important. Even though they're weak in the summer, they provide a triggering mechanism for extreme precipitation. With all the water vapor that's present in the summer, a lot of those frontal events in that map are actually summer events, even down south towards the Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question from Simone Allen from NOAA PMEL for Ken. Oh, and I'm letting someone into the meeting. Okay, here in the Pacific Northwest, I think you showed less precipitation change to date than other parts of the US, but we are seeing on the ground is stronger separation of wet and dry seasons. Summers are so dry, and we have some rainfall records during single months or seasons most years since about 2015. These extremes definitely influence estuarine biogeochemistry. Wondering if you have looked at metrics for examining the shifts in rainfall across seasons at this national level that might help illuminate these more subtle shifts that don't show up in the annual averages. The wet extremes are atmospheric rivers, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at this seasonal thing, the shift that's been occurring. I've only been looking at the extreme events in the Pacific Northwest. They're primarily a fall-winter phenomenon. And so, and indeed, there have been some big ones, statistically, there is an upward trend there. Although it's much smaller than the rest of than the eastern US, but it is there, unlike the Southwest where we see nothing. So I don't know if there's anything else I have to say about that question. Yeah, I guess, go to the first part of that question. I have not looked at this contrast and this change in severity and the contrast between the wet and dry.
Great.
One last question.
Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating, and this may go well beyond what you researched, but I'm curious to know whether you or others are looking at this. It seems like, so we have a shift in the natural patterns, but then at the same time, we have more and more urbanization and impermeable surfaces, et cetera. So what I'm interested in is, what is the impact of that rainfall? Is anybody looking at, not only is there more, but we have even more impermeable surfaces in these urban areas, so the flooding is even worse. Is anybody doing that calculation to get to what is this really?
Well, I know that some people are trying to kind of sort out and it's not me, but sort out the link then to actual flooding on the ground. So you've got that going on, and can you tease out a signal there? The other thing that's been going on in some parts of the US that you see this maybe big trend, that's kind of true in parts of the north. You see this big trend, but you don't necessarily see a trend in flooding. And some of that is due to a shift in when these extreme events are occurring. So the increases are definitely, in some parts of the US, concentrated in the summer. Well, in the summer, soils are drier, there's more capacity to absorb rainfall. So the potential impacts, the link, and stream flow levels are low anyway. So the link to flooding then is often kind of broken a little bit. You don't get the signal being transferred to the flooding signal. Unlike if you have big events occurring in the spring, for example, maybe if you're in a snowy area, you've got the snow melt on top of that. Or even if you're not, the soils are saturated, so more of that rain goes into runoff. There are people working on it, but it's actually an open question, a science question. And if you look at the IPCC's report, they're much more ambiguous about historical trends in flooding than they are about historical trends in extreme precipitation.
Great. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that there will be a discussion session after these two talks, so save your questions if you have one for later. So next we have Kevin Reed from Stony Brook. And here we go. Wow, that's quite a picture there, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So while I'm waiting for the slides to come up, I'll get to that last question that was asked. There are groups that have done modeling experiments, for example, during Hurricane Harvey, in which they changed the land surface type to be less urbanization and have tried to quantify the impact of flooding due to urbanization, for example. So there are groups doing it, but they're in kind of storyline, individual kind of timecast simulations. But a big part of the future projections for IPCC, there is a lot of assumptions related to land cover and land use change. You know, how meaningful they are at the local level where a lot of this type of flooding occurs. As Ken was mentioning, it's probably not nearly as helpful.
Beautiful.
I'm going to focus a little bit more now on these modeling frameworks. So Ken kind of finished his talk talking a little bit about future projections. And I'm going to, I formatted my talk to kind of really talk about a few different ways in which we use models, numerical models, to kind of explore how coastal storms change in climate change. And the main motivation, of course, is actually similar to what Ken showed, right? That there's been a large number of extreme events over the last kind of few decades. And then if you look, right, and I'm motivated in part by a different data set than Ken showed, which is the $1 billion disasters, so the events that cause a $1 billion disaster or of damage in the United States. And if you look at a plot of this, just similar to what Ken had showed, you'll see that on the eastern United States, that most of the $1 billion disasters are due to extreme flooding events or too much rainfall, where most of the West is focused on events of a lack of rainfall. And then if you actually look at the trends in the number of $1 billion disasters, particularly even if they've been corrected for inflation, you actually see that there's been a large shift in the number of these events. And a number of these are coastal related events, right? So particularly hurricanes. And I think that this is getting really at what Ken had showed, but really focusing on the observations that if you look at the National Climate Assessment, it very specifically says, right, that changes in extreme weather are the primary way in which humans will experience climate change. So here's just this map I was telling you about. So here's for 2011, or sorry, 21, and you can see that particularly in the Gulf states that there was a lot of damage due to tropical cyclones, and that if you look at how these have changed over the last 40 plus years, you'll note that there's been a large increase in the number of these $1 billion disasters. And this is kind of consistent with maybe what we'd expect in the change in moisture, which can lead to more flooding. or at least more precipitation, which leads to more flooding. But it's not, of course, the only answer, as we were just talking about at the beginning, right? That there's also been the aspect that humans in general have made ourselves more susceptible to these types of events over this time period as well. So I'm just going to highlight a couple quick motivations for my talk, which is really focused on trying to bridge this gap between what we have just mentioned from Ken, these low resolution models that are typically used for climate projection, and that we're kind of entering an era where these tools, these numerical models, are actually starting to approach the kind of weather scales that are typically used. And I'll show what that means in a minute. And that it's really advances in these type of climate modeling tools are really improving our ability to look at individual extreme events and project regional impacts of climate change. And then I'm going to finish with there's possibilities to actually use these type of models in hindcast mode, kind of in a weather mode, to actually kind of get at one of the first questions from the last speaker, which is related to how can we actually translate, or can we use these to look at different disciplines or look at intersections and inform local policy. So methodology, so we're going to be using, I'm going to be using numerical models, and so this plot got messed up when I switched to PDF, but look at the long box on the right. So this is what's typically used for climate modeling, what Ken had showed towards the end of his talk, which is typically on the order of 100-kilometer grid spacings that are run for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And these are typically meant to resolve climate processes, so climate variation and so seasonal cycles. If you think about the weather models, this is this kind of more square box here, which actually represents, it's typically run on the order of maybe 10-kilometer grid spacing and maybe run for a week or two. But this allows you to start to simulate those mesoscale and synaptic scale events. And so what we've been doing in my group, as well as some of my colleagues around the world, is really focusing on, can we bridge this gap? Can we run a climate model at, say, 25-kilometer resolution? So you start to resolve these synoptic scale features such as tropical cyclones, but the downside is you can't run it for hundreds of years, you can only run it for a few decades. And so this is actually what we're doing. We're using the National Center for Atmospheric Research's community atmosphere model. I'm going to show you some results with the kind of current standard or conventional climate model resolution of 100-kilometer grid spacing. Which is very coarse, right, as we were just talking about. But I'll show what some examples of what we could start to do if we just kind of increase that to 25 kilometers, which is an order of magnitude plus change in computational cost. But it allows us to start to look at more local events. And so one of the things, just another quick methodology note, is I'm going to focus a lot on tropical cyclones, the TCs, for this talk. And so we've developed a way, this was done by a former student of mine, who's now at Colorado State University, but we've developed a way to actually identify tropical cyclones in large climate data sets. We've found a way to stitch them together in trajectories. We then calculate their size by creating radial profiles of wind, and then we can do things like this. We can extract out rainfall that's directly from tropical cyclones. So this is a different kind of technique than what Ken has used, but it's a way to kind of extract and find precipitation that's related to tropical cyclones to try to link changes to the actual event types. So that was just a quick aside. So let me jump into some of the kind of conventional climate model-like simulations, decadal simulations that we use to try to explore change in coastal storms, particularly hurricanes. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to be using CAM. We're going to use horizontal resolution 125. These are atmosphere-only simulations, so they follow the CMIT protocol, which is part of the IPCC process, or goes oftentimes into forming IPCC results. But they're the AMIT simulations, so they're prescribed sea surface temperatures. And we run a variety of simulations for the historical climate, as well as the kind of RCP settings for future climate towards the end of the century. Similar to what Ken was showing towards the end of his talk. We do a couple things with the model, so I'll show some global results, but we also do these variable resolution setups, so we can run with a high resolution, 25-kilometer resolution over our domain of interest, which for us happens to be the eastern United States and the North Atlantic, where hurricanes form. And the advantage of this is it allows us to actually start to run ensembles Ensembles is a loose use of the term here, it's 3, but it's more than is typically used for high resolution because of the computational constraints. So let me just start with some high-level results. So if you run one of these, this gets at one of the questions that was asked on this side of the room towards the end of Ken's talk as well, which is, if you run a conventional climate model and you run it for, in this case, 20 plus years, and you track the number of tropical cyclones using that objective tracker that I briefly mentioned, this is the number of hurricanes you get in all 20 plus years, and all 26 years of simulation. So you can count them by hand, and if you look at their tracks, they don't make sense. They kind of go north-south. And if you run at high resolution, so if the only thing you change in the model is the resolution, and I say that loosely acknowledging that, as I mentioned, it's an order plus magnitude increase. So you run a simulation at 25 kilometers, this is the number of hurricanes. And there you notice that not only do you start to get more intense storms, you can get ones that actually reach category 4 strength, but their tracks start to become much more what you expect. Now, the only downside is that a simulation like this costs a couple million computer hours to run one simulation. Now, if you compare it to observations, just like any model, it's not perfect. You'll notice if I just toggle in between these, there's some biases. But if you focus on certain areas like the North Atlantic, they can be quite reasonable at simulating those tracks and where they should occur, where they form, and where they may landfall. So some of the stuff we did kind of using some of these global simulations as we started to get at this question that Ken also mentioned, which is, is there a change in the number of these events globally? And so you'll notice that if you just focus on the comparison of the blue, which is the historical, to the red, which is the future, you see that actually there is a suggestion that there's a pretty substantial decrease, a statistically significant decrease in the future in the number of overall storms, and maybe even a decrease in the number of hurricanes. But we anticipate that there'll be a larger percentage of storms that are actually kind of major, category 3, 4, 5 storms. And this has also been shown, and I won't go into the detail, there's a suggestion over the last 40 plus years that you actually see this trend in at least increasing strength of the most extreme storms. So what we do with these simulations is we start to look at regional impact. So we use that regional refined domain that allows us to run 25 kilometers over the North Atlantic. We're able to run a couple simulations, and I'm going to skip over the validation part of it and just jump into the future projections. But what you see here is another way of counting for frequency. So the top panel shows you the storm hours. It's the number of hours per year that a simulated storm impacts the coast of the United States. And so you can see for large parts of Florida, you get about 2 days per year in which you're experiencing a hurricane. On average, some years it's much more, some years it's 0. And if you look at the future projections for the North Atlantic, and now we're using 2 scenarios. We're using an RCP 4.5, so this is kind of this middle road scenario in the future, and an RCP 8.5, which is the kind of business as usual, as you call it. And you'll notice that if you focus on storm track, or storm hours over the United States, it's actually gone down in these future projections. So if you look at rainfall, and this, I call it rainfall here, but it is a metric similar to what Ken showed earlier. It's what we call RX 5 days. So this is the amount of rainfall that accumulates over 5 days that comes now from tropical cyclones only. And you'll notice, of course, that in historical simulations, it's kind of where you anticipate, right, that most of the rainfall from hurricanes comes over Florida, as well as right along the coast of the Carolinas and in the Gulf. And if you go into future projections, you'll notice that, whoa, the amount of rainfall kind of in that middle of the road scenario has gone down. And the amount of this is annual rainfall from in the future projection, the further future, the more extreme case, has also somewhat gone down, but maybe there's starting to be some increases in some areas. But another metric to look at, which is if you have a decrease in your storm hours, but maybe a decrease in your rainfalls, you can also look at how much rainfall is falling per hour of storm impact. And if you look at that, then the picture becomes significantly clearer. That in some regions, particularly in the Gulf area where there's a lot more moisture availability, that the amount of rainfall per hour of storm impact is actually significantly increasing in the future, or projected to increase in the future. And there's we've done work in which we've shown that if you start to look at historical record, you start to see this as well. And that kind of matches well with what Ken just showed. And I just want to quickly mention that this is just for tropical cyclones. We've expanded this work, so we also look at extratropical transitioning storms. So these are the storms kind of like Irene or even Fiona from last month, right, which undergo extratropical transition and then make landfall, for example, up in Nova Scotia, up in New England, as an extratropical storm. And we've been looking at the percentage of precipitation that come from them, and actually in large parts of, for example, the Pacific Northwest, there's a huge contribution of extreme precipitation comes from these type of events. And so we're also looking at how that changes. And I'll just mention really quick that we also are trying to connect to these reasons why. So Ken gave a great overview of why we expect hurricanes potentially, or precipitation in general, but this also relates to hurricanes, wildlife change with increasing moisture. So I'm not going to go into that, but we've started to connect this to theory. We started to do idealized simulations in which we try to have idealized changes in warming and try to see how that matches. And so just wanted to mention that we see these changes, they're consistent across the historical simulations, they're consistent in observations, and they're actually consistent in idealized simulations that are much more connected to basic atmospheric theory. But I want to finish talking with a different approach that we've used, using the same type of climate models, but to try to explore how rainfall has actually changed in individual events that have occurred, let's say, in the last 5 to 10 years. And so this is what we call climate change event attribution. It's oftentimes a question that when we have an event like Ian, journalists are often coming to the scientists and asking, oh, did climate change impact this event? Or the question 10 years ago was this event due to climate change? And I think we've seen a shift through dialogue with journalists, and with the question is now, was this event changed because of climate change? And this is exactly what this type of methodology has been developed to in order to explore. And so we use a storyline approach for this. So I'm using the same climate model, and the difference is now I'm using the same grid, but the main difference is I've turned the climate model into a weather model. So instead of initializing at some random time in the past and running for decades, we just initialize at a specific time using the National Weather Service's operational initial conditions that goes into the global forecast system, which is run every 6 hours in the United States. And then we can run a set of simulations in advance of a hurricane making landfall, for example. And we also then create a counterfactual simulation, we call it, which is now using, since we're using a climate model, we can actually go back to those simulations and remove the large-scale climate change signal space and rerun our forecast. And so I'll show a little bit about what that means in a minute. But again, I just want to highlight that these are atmosphere-only simulations, so they're forced boundary conditions from prescribed sea surface temperatures. So to do this, and this is a quick plug that we use, the BetaCast implementation is what it is. It's just a fancy name to say we're running a forecast and a climate model, but you have to be careful that you call it forecast because the forecasters will be worried. So we call it BetaCast, and this is just a way to run cast in the past. It's been developed in part by my colleague Colin Zarzicki at Penn State University, who's developed ways to initialize the model, to do some initial adjustments in the atmospheric model, how to actually spin up land conditions for the specific event, as well as how to regrid the ocean in order to run your hindcast. And when I want to get back to how we build these counterfactuals, and so the advantage here is we also are running a climate model, or we're running weather mode in a climate model, which means we also have climate simulations on the model. So we have, for example, what are the historical simulations that are typically run as part of CNIP, and this is the red line, for example, in which you're trying to mimic the historical past. And then we oftentimes run 1850 control runs, they're called, or they're called match-only simulations, in which you remove changes in land use, greenhouse gases, and things like that, and you also simulate the last 100+ years, so you get this kind of green one. And so all we're doing is we're actually running simulations of a specific event, and then we remove the difference between these lines, essentially, and it's more sophisticated than that, because there are 3D deltas. And then we run what would Hurricane Florence have looked like in the natural run, or what would Florence look like in a world without climate change? And so this is kind of how we do it. We build our counterfactuals using the CDXM, which is the coupled version of the model we've been using for our atmospheric simulations. This is an example of what this large scale signal looks like if you remove it. So this is just for sea surface temperature. So kind of similar to what we've seen. And of course, you see that most of the oceans have warmed, as Ken actually mentioned. If you look at the North Atlantic, it's actually warmed by about 0.6 degrees Celsius, or about a degree Fahrenheit on average. But it's worth noting that when we do these counterfactuals, we're not just removing 0.6 everywhere, we're removing the full 2D field, and then we're also adjusting the full 3D temperature fields and the full 3D moisture fields, as Ken mentioned, which is crucial for extreme precipitation. So we can do things like run a counterfactual of an event like Hurricane Florence. So here's one of the first cases in which we did this. We've initialized our weather model, or climate model, the weather model. We've run a forecast multiple days before Hurricane Florence made landfall. And you'll see in the red lines that this is the forecasted projection, the forecasted path of Hurricane Florence. We've run 98 ensemble simulations because they're relatively cheap because they're forecast simulations. And you'll notice that multiple days in advance of Hurricane Florence's landfall, we actually are able to not only capture landfall timing, but capture it at within like about 25 to 30 kilometers of the actual landfall location. And so again, if you just focus on the red line first, we're also able to slow those dots or 12-hour increments, so we actually capture the slowing that happened with Hurricane Florence. But of course, right, 2.5, 3 days before landfall, we didn't capture the track perfect. And this was true for any operational model at the initialization time. And so we don't capture the track this multiple days in advance, but we're able to get the landfall location and the slowdown. And then the blue line is the world without climate change, right? So again, we start with Florence in our initial conditions. We've removed the large-scale climate change signal. And so this is a Florence without climate change. And again, you'll notice that the trajectories are very similar. And this is a critical aspect when you do these type of simulations, because this is what we call, meaning now it's fit for purpose, meaning that we can actually just compare the characteristics of these two simulations because their tracks are relatively similar. Or I should not say individual simulations, these are, as I mentioned, 98 number of sums. So then we can do things like this, right? So you see, of course, on the left is the observed rainfall from Florence, which as Ken had showed, right, had almost 3 feet of rainfall in some locations, particularly right near where it made landfall, but it went pretty far in. If you look at the actual forecast, this is when we're trying to actually mimic reality. You'll notice that we are able to capture those extreme rainfall amounts. So we have areas that are over 3 or at least 30 inches of rainfall, that they're kind of near the coast. Of course, the specific location is slightly off because the track is slightly different, particularly after rainfall. But the fact that we're able to reproduce those specific amounts means that we can then compare it to the counterfactual. And so the counterfactual you can see here is on the right. This is that world without climate change, and you'll notice that the accumulated amounts are significantly lower. And so we've done some statistics, and you calculate this, and you can say actually that the rainfall increased by 5% due to the observed human-induced climate change. Or another way to say it is that in a world without climate change, it would have 5% less precipitation, which of course doesn't seem like a lot, but right, 5% is different in a couple inches. In storms that produce a lot of rainfall, a couple inches is a lot of rainfall on its own. But the way I often say to journalists is that if your boss called you in and wanted to give you a 5% raise, you take it and be pretty happy about it, right? So it's a substantial amount when you think about it. So we've been working to optimize this more to be more useful than just one individual event. So we've shown where if you can look at the 2020 season, we can run these hindcasts or beta casts every 3 days throughout the hurricane season for all of 2020. And we can do the same thing. We can create a counterfactual. What would the storms have looked like in 2020 without climate change? We can then calculate the rainfall using that extraction that I mentioned way back earlier for a tropical cyclone only rainfall. And then you can start to do analysis. And so I'll just show this as 3 hourly rainfall amounts. So this is focusing on kind of those short duration extreme precipitation. And you'll notice that throughout the whole hurricane season, when we run these, so we've run 60 different initializations, right? We produced over 1,400 simulations for each the actual and counterfactual. You'll notice that the red line is always above the blue line, which means that in the real world, there's always a likelihood of higher extreme rates than in a world without climate change. And then if you focus on the 99th percentile of the individual 1,000+ simulations, we actually see a shift in this extreme short, or let's say large amount of rain in a short period of time, about 10% in 2020. So 10% more of the extreme rainfall, or there's a 10% increase in the magnitude of the extreme rainfall in 2020 due to climate change. And then we can do the same thing for accumulated rainfall. So this is focused in on the accumulation over a 3-day period, or RX 3-day. And you can see that here again, there's a very clear shift, and it's about 5%. And so what this tells us is that when we've done analysis for things like Florence or Harvey or Dorian, which actually dumped almost a meter of rainfall in the Bahamas, that we aren't just focusing on the most extreme events, and if you focus on all storms throughout the season, your run-of-the-mill, hurricane that doesn't make landfall even, that it's also increased its precipitation. And so there is no selection bias in the fact that the most extreme storms are the only ones changing. Actually, these numbers go up if you focus only on hurricane strength storms, slightly. So just to finish up, so as the surface temperature warms, both the mean precipitation and extreme precipitation associated with tropical cyclones is expected to increase, and that magnitude of the extreme precipitation actually can increase at larger rates than just the mean. So I didn't show that in too much detail here, but that's something that we've seen in those climate simulations. So you're getting a bigger change at the extreme end, and that's something that can actually show as well. That decadal simulations at high resolution really start to shed light on regional changes in coastal events like tropical cyclones. But of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty in landfall location, right? And that's kind of our biggest uncertainty. A lot can determine where storms are actually going to be in the future. And then these event attribution simulations demonstrate that human-induced climate change can actually increase extreme precipitation and accumulations by 5 and 11%, depending upon whether you focus on hurricanes or all storms or individual storms like Florence. And I just want to finish up with a couple examples of how we're kind of starting to expand, particularly the kind of storyline-like simulations, but I think they might be relevant to this group, which is we're trying to, can we adapt these attribution frameworks but look at them forward? So sometimes they're referred to as suitable warming simulations, but can we actually adapt this hindcast approach to actually look at what would, for example, a Florence look like in a 2 or 3 or 4 degree warmer world? And so, right, so if we're lucky and we meet the Paris Agreement, right, we could look, that's a 2 degree warmer world. What's the difference between Florence then versus a situation in which it ends up being a 4 degree warmer world? And these can maybe make this more useful for decision making, or at least planning for alternatives. And it allows you to use the historical event that you maybe are already planning around in your local regions to be used as your baseline for building climate information into your zoning, for example. And here's just an example. We've done this for Hurricane Irma through a Department of Energy project in which we worked directly with water resource managers in Florida. And this is an example of what you kind of see for Irma. You can kind of see this really large increase in a 4 degree warmer world of 26%. And this is actually a number that's strikingly similar to some of the stuff that Ken showed when he showed the most extreme event in the 30-year. And you were seeing in large parts of the world, you were seeing these 20, 30, 40% increases in those events. And so I'll just finish with saying that I just only showed work for tropical cyclones here, but we've been doing the same thing similar to what Ken showed with fronts. We've been looking at fronts and looking at how they change. We've been looking at extratropical cyclones. And so we've been looking at a variety of coastal extreme events. So thank you.
Time for a few questions. Tom?
Thanks very much. Something really expertise. I'm just thinking that more and more people are discussing climate change as sort of the increasing frequency of disorder, physical disorder, atmospheres, just other regions of the biosphere. And this idea of less frequency of cyclones, but more intense in the future. I think that's related to the idea of increasing disorder to the right threshold to create a cyclone. But then when it does, you get more fallout from it. Is because this is a question that people are starting to look at from very fundamental entropy perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll.
Kevin, can you repeat the question? I
Yeah, so
couldn't
the
hear it.
question is kind of, there's the fact that we see decreases in storms potentially, but increases in the severity of the storms. It's just kind of related to this kind of general concept of increasing disorder in the system. And, let me just jump to the physical side of it from a tropical cyclone viewpoint. So a tropical cyclone, in order to form, kind of needs a relatively unstable environment that's moist. And you need some kind of pre-disturbance. And those are things that Ken showed us that are increasing, right, in the future, or have increased even over the historical record, in the sense that over the ocean, particularly where cyclones form, it's becoming moister. But at the same time, one of the clearest signals of climate change is actually that the atmosphere itself, on an average, becomes more stable. And so what that suggests is it kind of creates this convergence of, right, that you're having less storms because the atmosphere is more stable, but you have the environment that is just ready for a storm as soon as you're able to trigger across that threshold. And tropical cyclones, I think, are one of the greatest examples of that in our system, in which, there only are about 90 of them per year on the globe, and they actually form, right? It's when you have the right set of conditions together, it's when they form. Now, we don't actually fully understand why they form in certain environments and not in others. So I do think it's kind of really connected, and it's maybe at a really macro level for tropical cyclone, or at least much more macro. But that's also, there is some debate still of trying to understand what are the real precursors to events, and are those numbers changing, or are we stimulating them appropriately? And I'll just finish with saying that people have done these type of simulations where they do a different type of downscaling, statistical downscaling, and they take the large scale environment from the CMIT models that Ken was talking about, and then they'll seed them with tropical cyclone models. And in those cases, if you assume that the seeding rate is the same in the future that it is now, they actually can see increases in storms in the future. And so that shows that there is still this fundamental understanding that we're not that we're lacking, but it's not, we still have a lot to learn about why storms form in what conditions.
Yes, Joey?
Yeah, thanks for your talk. This kind of dovetails with that just a little bit. And I was thinking, as Tom was asking his question, so you showed your the actual and then the counterfactual climate simulations. Can you simulate storms that would have occurred in the counterfactual that may not have occurred in the actual, if you project that out far enough?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like a challenge, yeah.
So what we've done traditionally is we take actual events, right, that are occurring. But there is, and I actually do have a project with some UK colleagues that's starting, in which we're focused on maybe taking synthetic storms. So looking in these high resolution climate models and maybe using those as our storms to then run these hindcasts. And so that's something that we potentially looking into, right? So could you find a storm that could have happened in an 1850 controlled no climate change run and use that and force it under the changes and just kind of explore how different they might be. So that's something that we haven't done that we are interested in doing. And I'll just mention really quick, and I always joke, this is how you know you're an academic, right? You can turn a simple question into something a little bit longer. But we are also interested in these kind of what we call worst case tracks. So Irma was a perfect example. There was a time in Irma's forecast where, if anybody remembers, it was actually forecasted to hit Miami. And it was only a few days before this initialization that we're running here. And so we are starting to use that as kind of synthetic, what if Irma hit Miami, what would the rainfall look like? And also, what would Irma in Miami plus climate change look like? Because that might be something that's useful for decision making or for planning or for potential connections to water resources, for example.
Quick last question, and then we'll convene up here.
Hi. The other
side to tropical cyclones is storm surge.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if you know of anyone who's also, or if you are also going to be modeling storm surge, say, like what happened with Hurricane Sandy, where the storm surge is what really did damage to New York City, whereas precipitation did more damage further inland.
Yeah.
To homes and businesses.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in short, we don't look at it directly, in part because that we know that one of the things that climate models are good at, as we've showed for the last 10 plus years, is they are able to simulate these extreme precipitation rates in hurricanes when you can simulate the hurricanes. And so we focused on that. But there are folks out there that have looked at storm surge in actual and counterfactual, right? So what would a world without climate change look like, and how would flooding for Sandy specifically be different? But when they do that, they typically focus on a little bit more of a metric of what's sea level rise, how much sea level rise have we had, and they just do a delta of adding that onto the storm surge. They haven't looked at the changing size or intensity of storms and what that means for a specific storm surge event. I have worked with some people at the University of Florida that have focused on using these type of simulations to inform a more statistical model of storm surge. But this is a little bit more ongoing because storm surge, as you kind of mentioned, is much more hyperlocal, right? So the type of, we saw this with Ian, right? If Ian would have made landfall slightly different, storm surge would have been drastically different. And so for precipitation, of course, it's dependent on where it makes landfall, but the precipitation rates you'd expect aren't nearly as tied to landfall location. And so it's a little bit more of a difficult thing to start to try to tease out the climate change signal. But there are folks certainly working on it in hard.
Great, thank you very much. Chris, did you want to say?
Yeah, so at this point, I'd like to invite Ken up and to join Kevin. And we have about 15 minutes or so before our break for open questions for both our speakers.
And if I could ask, when you are raising your hand to ask a question, speak as loudly as you can into the microphone, and please say your name and where you're from, just to help our online people feel like they know what's going on. Thank you.
Hello. So this is Mohammed from Kuwait University. So I'm basically from the desert in Kuwait. So I've been noticing, most of the talks and topics related to either typhoons, hurricanes, but I've seen like no one even mentioned sandstorms, especially in our region. So, and you just said, Kevin, that you're just focusing on a certain type of storms. This question to all of you, like, did you consider like doing a sandstorm analysis, something? Did you expand your expertise and expand your research, something like this?
Yeah. I'll quickly respond, which is I haven't worked on sandstorms, but I think that there is a way to potentially expand it in the sense that you could look at the environmental conditions that commonly lead and this kind of meteorological conditions and synoptic scale events that could lead to sandstorms. And I think that's something that could be done. But the question is, and of course, how well are those type of conditions resolved in models at scale? And that's an only question I don't know that I'm sure people are working on. I will mention real quick though that these conventional climate models now are starting to actually be able to model dust transport in general. So they actually have fully prognostic aerosol models that do account for uplift of dust up into the air based on the right conditions. And we've seen that actually be really important for our simulations of hurricanes, so bringing it back, which is, right, if you look at the North Atlantic, that there is a strong connection between years of large dust outbreaks and having reduced cyclone activity than in years with little dust. And that's something that these models can reproduce that relationship. So there's potential there. I'm just bringing it up because there's potential there to maybe then look at the more kind of source of the dust uplift.
Hi, this is John Komansky from Florida International University, and I guess it's a general question for both of y'all. And Ken, maybe your talk alluded to it, and I know that you've dealt with this in the past, but the timing of precipitation seasonal shifts how much of that is involved in the work that you're doing, and what are the patterns that you're seeing? Because we see just in South Florida that we're getting a shortening of our wet season, and it sometimes is where the wet season ends early or the dry season or starts late. And so we do have a bit of a drought flood challenge that we deal with in sort of the larger landscape. But how much of those shifts in onset or offset of wet dry are you seeing in any of your modeling?
Well, once again, I say that I'm not necessarily looking at the drought side. What I would say is that we've done a seasonal breakdown of these increases in extremes that they are dominated by increases in the warm season in most places. Now, caveat that is that if you look at like the West Coast, where the wet season is so dominantly the winter time, we don't see an increase in the warm season there. For the East and West, the increases we see relatively speaking, there's a greater increase in the warm season, particularly in summer months, than you would expect from just a general raising the whole seasonal, the whole seasonal cycle.
So it's skewed.
So, the increase is dominant in summer. You say anything more?
Thanks.
I have a question. Can I ask a question, Chris?
Yes, you may.
Okay, one thing, I live in Carter County, at the edge here, we get a lot of storms. One thing we're always praying for is that the storms will recur. And I'm just curious how that might fit in with, the stuff you guys are talking about. That's a very complicated physical question, but any idea of, what's controlling the curvature of these storms over time? I know you're not ocean circulation guys, but I'm just curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I can comment quickly, which is, a lot of it, of course, depends upon the large scale conditions, and which then is, of course, tied oftentimes to the seasonal anomalies in ocean temperature. And that's something that we have a little, we don't have that much, I don't know how to say this, but there's a lot of uncertainty in it, right? So you can look at these projections that Ken was showing us earlier, look at the SST, and you can make a mean plot that show really smooth warming throughout large parts of the Atlantic, for example. But if you were looking at individual models, they would have very different patterns. And that pattern of warming has a huge impact on potentially recurring storms. And so, understanding if storms are going to recur or not is something that people are looking into, but haven't had as much success of saying, oh, there's going to be more recurring storms or not. But we do, I think, have a pretty good understanding of why certain storms do recur or not. And I think, one of the biggest potential players that has an impact on this is, right, one of the clear signals of warming, particularly in the northern hemisphere, is the fact that the pole is warming faster than the equator. And this changes mid-latitude dynamics and the jet stream strength and potentially how much the jet stream can wiggle. And that has huge implications for where storms go. I mean, we've seen this in a variety of them now, like Sandy is, of course, a great example. And so there are folks that are trying to understand that type of connection, and more generally, with a weaker jet stream, or maybe in the fall, a weaker jet stream with a little bit more wiggle, does it have impact on the type of where storms go in general? And that's an area where people are starting to look at, but there's no definitive results.
It's not directly answering the question, but it gives me an opportunity to talk about something else. And that is, the sea surface temperature pattern, and I showed this nice, fairly smooth curve going up. But if you look at any snapshot of time, the spatial pattern is very complex. And so so you have the shifting patterns of anomalies, chemistry. So let's take, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, and you look at the sea temperature pattern in there, and it's definitely up. But man, there's a huge amount of variability from year to year. So 1 year it might be below average during hurricane season. And that still is a possibility, even though the overall trend is upward in the Gulf of Mexico. But next year, who knows? Hurricane season might be below average. So then we'll be talking to reporters Stop Valley. No, sea surface temperatures actually decrease the intensity of hurricane fill in flight. Or we could.
And then, of course, we have the difference between El Nino and
Thank you. Bruno Johnson, PML. I'm going to use one of the dirty words here. We really want to think about climate change mitigation, but we're coming more and more to a point where adaptation might be something to think about. Where are we in that? Can we use these kind of forecasting projects or forecasting exercises to be able to tell someone where to buy a house or how to where to move in principle? Because this is like kind of conversations I end up in very often, probably with some of my friends or preppers. And I just wonder, because that it seems to be something where you can actually go and say, maybe not buy a house in Miami. Here's the reasons. Vermont seems much better right now, but where are we standing in the extreme rain event for Vermont? Like, is this a conversation we can start having with these kind of data?
Chris, before we go further, a quick question. In Seesaw, does SAW apply to the cyclical nature or does it apply to the land to ocean connection?
Repeat the question.
I'll repeat the question. I'll have the question asker repeat his question.
Hi, this is the question asker. And the question was, does a SAW and Seesaw refer to the cyclical nature of these disturbances or the land to ocean connection or the resurgence of the carbon after burial? So is there a specific definition of SAW? And I'm from East Carolina University, it's a Mitra.
I'm not sure that it was exactly, so was that for our speakers or just is this a general?
Hey, Chris, I think since he butted in with his question, I think we can have this additional over here too, but it's up to you.
I actually have an answer to it.
Oh, we have an answer.
This is Blake Schaefer from the Environmental Protection Agency. So actually what I was going to propose is probably a question to you all. The maps that you showed were essentially frequency, duration, extent, magnitude. And it seems like if they're searchable or you can be queried, this community, they can ask that question of, is it how often do they occur or how strong they are, or a combination of all three, and where then location-wise and timing-wise on your maps should this community select sentinel sites for studies going forward?
Maybe I'll just, I think, yeah, the use of IDF curves is something that the climate community has tried to adapt as a way to translate that information. So as part of the project that I'm involved with, I mentioned, which is the Department of Energy project called Hyperfacets. They have created IDF curves for some of our study regions. But as you know, creating IDF curves, it's very challenging. It's challenging, particularly once you realize that the assumption is we do not live in a stable climate, and we probably never have, right? So in terms of how do you create the IDF curve in a climate that's transitioning is something that it creates difficulty, but I do think that that's one way that we could really help tie directly to more local events. And then you just have to come up with the fact that you have to do some type of downscaling to get there from even the high resolution climate modeling, which is still relatively coarse for an individual station level idea.